Hello everyone.
About 70% of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be very happy if you did.
I know many of you use these videos to fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening from around the world. Story 1. I woke up like any other day, groggy from the restless sleep that always seemed to follow a late-night work session. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, a steady stream of notifications flashing across the screen. Normally, I would ignore them until I got out of bed, but something caught my eye, an alert from my bank. It was a large transaction, something I certainly didn't recognize. I rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a mistake, or maybe just an overdraft, but as I scrolled through the other notifications, my heart sank. Every account I had, from my bank to my credit cards and even my social media, had been accessed. And not just accessed, completely changed. I tried to log into my bank account, but the password was wrong. I quickly attempted to reset it, but the email that was supposed to arrive never came. Panic began to rise in my chest. I checked my social media accounts next, only to find that all my profiles had been updated, new photos, new posts, and worst of all, messages I didn't send. My stomach twisted as I tried to understand how someone could take over every aspect of my life so seamlessly. It wasn't just a breach of privacy, it felt like a complete erasure of my identity, as though I no longer existed in my own life. Frantically, I called my bank, hoping to stop the transactions before they escalated. The customer service representative was kind, but there was nothing they could do at that moment. "We'll put a hold on your account," she told me. "But you should contact your other services and report the theft as soon as possible." Her voice was sympathetic, but it did little to calm the overwhelming sense of violation. As I hung up, I realized that the thief wasn't just using my identity, they were living it better than I ever had. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The fresh air outside was supposed to be comforting, but as I looked around, I saw nothing but reminders of the life I was supposed to have. People walked by, laughing with friends, chatting on their phones, things I had done countless times before. I checked my phone again, hoping to find some resolution, but the thief had been busy. Not only had they posted photos of places I'd never been, but they had also shared stories about things I'd never done. It was like they were living out the version of me that I had always wanted to be. More confident, more outgoing, more successful. My feed was full of pictures from exotic vacations, nights out with friends I didn't recognize, and achievements in places I had never worked. The deeper I scrolled, the more I realized the thief wasn't just pretending to be me, they were doing a better job of it than I ever could. I'd always been the quiet, reserved type, the one who stayed in and focused on my career. But whoever had stolen my identity was living the life I'd always dreamed of, a life filled with adventure, excitement, and friends who seemed to adore them. I couldn't shake the feeling that not only was I losing control of my own life, but I was being left behind in a version of reality I no longer had access to. Desperation set in. I needed to stop this, to regain control over my life, but where could I even begin? The police were the logical next step, so I filed a report online, hoping they could trace the criminal somehow. But as I was typing out the details, I received a notification from my work email, another alert. This one was different from the others. It was a meeting invitation. It was from my boss, inviting me to a conference call to discuss some new projects I'd been a part of. The only problem? I hadn't been involved in any projects, let alone anything that required a meeting. I opened the invitation with trembling hands, hoping it was just a mistake. But the details were all there: times, dates, even notes about clients I didn't recognize. I scrolled down and saw a brief description of the work I had done. It was a project I had never heard of. But somehow, the thief had woven themselves into the fabric of my life, so convincingly that even my colleagues thought I was the one behind it. My heart was pounding in my chest as I dialed into the call, unsure of what to expect, but terrified of the consequences. The conference started, and to my horror, the me that showed up on the screen wasn't me at all. It was the thief, talking confidently, contributing ideas, even laughing at the right moments. They were playing the role so well, it was as if they were my twin, only better, more charismatic. For the next few days, The thief continued to live my life in a way that felt like it was slipping further and further out of my grasp. I watched as they posted updates about events I'd never attended, joined groups of people I didn't know, and even started dating someone from my past relationship I had long since ended. It wasn't just about the material things anymore. It was about my sense of self, my personal history, my very identity being twisted and rewritten by someone I had never met. I spent hours trying to reclaim my life. I changed my passwords, called my bank again, and reached out to anyone I could think of who might be able to help. But each attempt to recover what was mine felt like a futile exercise in frustration. It was as if the thief was always one step ahead of me. They'd already changed my contact details, leaving me unable to reach anyone who might be able to help. My friends seemed to believe I was the one who had been living this new life, this version of me that was spontaneous and outgoing, so I couldn't even turn to them for support. It felt like the more I tried to fight back, the more my identity slipped further from my grasp. Then, one morning, I woke up to a new post on my social media. It was a picture of the thief, sitting at a cafe, smiling at the camera. But what struck me wasn't the image itself, it was the caption. The old me was a ghost. This is the life I was always meant to have. The thief had left behind a final message. A cruel reminder that they had taken everything from me, not just my possessions or my online presence, but the life I had worked so hard to build. I couldn't shake the feeling of being trapped in someone else's life. The thief had found a way to erase me, to make me obsolete. And as I watched them live my life better than I ever had, I realized that my true self had been buried beneath a carefully constructed lie, one that had become more real than the truth. It was as if I no longer existed, not in the world they were creating, not in the life they were living, and not in the eyes of anyone who knew me. My identity had been stolen, and with it my future. Story 2. I hadn't seen Kyle in years. We used to be inseparable back in high school, always together, whether it was playing video games or just hanging out at the local diner. Then, without warning, he disappeared. No one heard from him, not a single word, and eventually we all assumed he'd moved away or decided to start fresh somewhere else. The silence was odd, but life moved on. That was until one chilly evening when I got a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end was familiar, but strange at the same time. "Hey, it's Kyle." My heart skipped a beat. It had been so long, and I hadn't even thought about him in months. The years had blurred, but hearing his voice brought back a flood of memories. "I need to see you," he added, his tone urgent. I agreed without hesitation, not knowing what to expect, but eager to reconnect with an old friend. We arranged to meet at the same diner where we'd spent countless afternoons together. It felt like no time had passed at all. When I saw him walk through the door, my breath caught in my throat. Kyle looked different. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow, like someone who had been through far more than I could comprehend. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt, and yet there was something undeniably familiar about him. As he sat down across from me, he smiled faintly, but it didn't reach his eyes. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken that lingered between us. I was about to ask him what had happened, but before I could say anything, he spoke first. "I've been missing for years," he said, his voice tinged with a quiet desperation. "You probably thought I just left, but that's not what happened. I don't remember everything, but I know something happened to me. Something bad." The words hung in the air, and I felt an uneasy chill run down my spine. Kyle had always been the more carefree of the two of us, never one for serious conversations. Now it was like a completely different person was sitting across from me. He continued, his eyes darting around as if checking the shadows for someone. "I've been trying to piece together what happened to me, but it's like there are these huge gaps in my memory. It's like I was gone, like I didn't exist for a while." His voice cracked as he spoke, and I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for him. At the same time, a knot of unease twisted in my stomach. His story didn't add up. Something about the way he spoke, the way he seemed to avoid certain topics, felt wrong. I tried to offer reassurance, though I wasn't sure what to say. "Kyle, whatever happened, it's okay. You're back now. We can figure this out." But he wasn't listening. He seemed lost in his own world, staring off into the distance, his hands fidgeting with the edges of his napkin. "I've been asking around," he muttered. "I've been trying to find people from our old circle, people we used to hang out with. But something's not right. They're different now. They don't act like they used to." His voice trailed off, and I felt a wave of confusion wash over me. What was he talking about? Why was he so fixated on the people we used to know? It wasn't until later that evening, as we walked through the dimly lit streets after dinner, that the full extent of his obsession became clear. Kyle began naming names, old friends from school, people I hadn't thought about in years. He would repeat their names like a mantra, almost as if trying to recall details that were just out of his reach. "Do you remember Marissa?" he asked, his voice sharp. I tried calling her, but she wouldn't pick up. "She's different now, isn't she?" I nodded, not sure what to make of it. Marissa had always been a bit distant after high school, but what was so strange about that? As we passed a familiar street corner, Kyle suddenly stopped in his tracks. His eyes widened, and he pointed toward the old convenience store we used to visit. "There," he whispered. "That's where we saw Jason last time before everything changed." I looked at him, puzzled. "Jason? Kyle? That was years ago. We haven't seen him in forever." But Kyle's face was pale, his gaze fixed on the store. No, we saw him. I remember it clearly. He was standing right there by the door. He looked different, like he wasn't even Jason anymore. His voice trembled, and I could see the fear in his eyes. It was the kind of fear that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We kept walking, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Kyle's obsession with the people we once knew was growing more intense by the minute. He began asking about people I hadn't spoken to in years, even people I'd lost contact with for good reason. And with every name he mentioned, he seemed to grow more agitated, more desperate need to reconnect, to remember what had happened. "I need to find them," he kept saying. "They're hiding something. They know what happened, and they're not telling me." That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about Kyle's words. His story didn't make sense. The more he talked, the more I realized how little I actually knew about what had happened to him. It was like he'd vanished from my life for years, only to return as someone I didn't recognize. The strange gaps in his memory, his obsession with the people we used to know, it all felt wrong. Something about it didn't sit right with me. The next day, I tried reaching out to some of the people Kyle had mentioned, hoping to get a clearer picture of what was going on. But no one had heard from him in years. Marissa, Jason, and the others, none of them had seen or heard from Kyle since he disappeared. I was starting to feel the weight of the situation settle in. Kyle's return wasn't just a reunion. It was a warning. Whatever he had been running from, whatever had happened to him, it wasn't over. And now it seemed like it was coming after all of us. As I sat there staring at my phone, I realized something chilling. Maybe the people Kyle had been trying to reach weren't different at all. Maybe he was the one who had changed. Story 3. I had lived next to Mr. Harrow for years, and yet I didn't know a thing about him. He was an elderly man who kept to himself, never engaging in small talk or greeting anyone when passing by. He would wave occasionally, a slight movement of his hand, but no words ever left his lips. Over time, I got used to the silence. His house was always dark, the windows curtained tightly, and though I could hear movement inside sometimes, I never once saw him interact with anyone in the neighborhood. It was as if he was a ghost who merely occupied space. The first time I really took notice of Mr. Harrow was when I found out he had passed away. I had been out running errands when I noticed the flashing lights of an ambulance parked in front of his house. A few days later, the news came through. He had died alone, quietly in his sleep. There was no family to speak of, no funeral announcements. The house was left untouched, with no one coming to claim the things he'd left behind. For the first time, I felt a strange curiosity about the man who had been a fixture in my life without me ever truly knowing him. A week after his death, a notice went up on the door of Mr. Harrow's house. The property was to be sold. The door was left unlocked, and a few real estate agents came by to look at the place. It wasn't until a neighbor told me that the agents were letting people inside to see if they wanted to buy it that I decided to take a look for myself. The idea of buying the house had never crossed my mind, but there was something about it that gnawed at me. I had to know what lay behind those dark windows. What had Mr. Harrow been hiding? When I stepped inside, the house felt eerily quiet, as if it had been suspended in time. The air was thick with dust, and the floorboards creaked beneath my feet. The furniture was old and mismatched, much like you would expect from someone who had lived alone for years. I wandered through the dimly lit rooms, but something felt off. The strangest part was that everything seemed so untouched. There were no personal items, no family pictures, no signs of a life lived. It was as if Mr. Harrow had simply existed in this house without ever leaving any trace of himself behind. It was in the attic, of all places, where I found the door. Hidden behind a stack of old boxes, there was a narrow door I had never noticed before. It was small, tucked away in the corner, and it had no handle, just a keyhole. Curiosity pushed me forward, and I immediately tried the knob. Surprisingly, it opened with a gentle turn, revealing a small, dimly lit room. My heart skipped as I stepped inside, feeling like I was entering a secret that had been buried for far too long. The room was filled with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned up on every inch of the walls. The pictures were old, faded with time, and many of them were in black and white. There were pictures of people I didn't recognize, strangers to me, and yet the faces seemed strangely familiar. As I walked around the room, my eyes scanned each photograph, trying to make sense of it all. I paused at one in particular, a group shot taken at a park. A young woman in the front, smiling brightly, looked directly into the camera. My breath caught in my throat. The woman in the picture had my face. I stared at the photo, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was me, no doubt about it. But it couldn't be. I was just a child in the picture, barely more than 5 years old. I had never seen this photograph before, and yet there I was, smiling alongside strangers. As I continued to examine the walls, the sickening truth began to dawn on me. There were more pictures like this. I saw myself in more and more of them, always a child, always in the background, surrounded by people I didn't know. The photos spanned years, decades, even showing me growing up, attending parties, family gatherings, and weddings I had no memory of. It was as though I had been a part of Mr. Harrow's life without ever realizing it. A sense of dread crept over me as I turned my attention to a large photo that hung above the others. It was a close-up of Mr. Harrow, sitting at a table with a drink in his hand. He was younger in this picture, his hair dark and his face fuller, but the expression in his eyes was haunting. He wasn't looking at the camera, he was looking at me. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that, in some twisted way, Mr. Harrow had been following me my entire life. It was as if he had been capturing my every moment, watching me grow but never once letting me know he was there. I backed away from the photos, my mind racing, trying to make sense of the nightmare unfolding before me. How had Mr. Harrow gotten these pictures? Why had he kept them hidden away? My chest tightened as I wondered if he had been watching me for years. I had never felt him observe me, but now it seemed impossible to ignore the idea that he had always been there, lurking in the shadows of my life. The room felt like a tomb, a graveyard of memories that weren't mine, yet were undeniably connected to me. I quickly left the attic and slammed the door behind me. I didn't know what to do or who to tell. I was shaken, deeply disturbed by what I had discovered. The photos were evidence of something far darker than I could comprehend, and I had no answers. When I left the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Harrow's presence was still with me. As I walked back to my own home, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me from a distance. But I knew that wasn't possible. He was gone. And yet somehow he was still there, hidden in the photographs, and in the quiet, unanswered questions I could never ask him. Story 4. It was supposed to be a simple, fun night out. My friends and I had booked a time at a local escape room, the latest craze in our city. The place had a glowing review promising intricate puzzles and a thrilling experience. We were all excited, laughing as we arrived, eager to put our wits to the test. None of us could have predicted that the night would end in sheer terror. The room was dark, with flickering lights casting long shadows across the walls. The theme was an old, mysterious mansion, and the host, a tall man in a black suit, briefed us on the rules before locking the door behind us. He handed us a series of old letters, cryptic and faded, and told us that solving the puzzles would unlock the secrets of the mansion. It all seemed harmless enough, at first. We were all eager to dive into the mystery, but something felt off. A strange tension hung in the air, but I dismissed it as just part of the experience. As we solved the first few puzzles, things started to get more unsettling. Each clue seemed oddly personal, as if someone had tailored them specifically to us. For instance, one puzzle required us to unlock a drawer with a combination that turned out to be the birth dates of my siblings. Another involved a strange photograph of my family, one I had never seen before. My heart began to race as I realized these weren't just random puzzles. Someone had done their homework on us. Someone knew our lives, perhaps even better than we did. We continued to solve the puzzles, but they only grew darker. The next clue led us to a small box hidden behind a painting of my childhood home. Inside was a letter written in my mother's handwriting, detailing the night my parents had argued just before their tragic divorce. The letter ended with the words, "If only you had stayed, you would have been safe." I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. How could they know this? My mother had never spoken of that night to anyone. The thought that someone had been watching me, or worse, stalking my past, gnawed at my nerves. As the puzzles progressed, they began to incorporate more and more elements of my personal life. A memory that I had long buried resurfaced a time when I was involved in a car accident during my senior year in high school. I had never told anyone about the true cause of that accident. Yet, in the next room, a puzzle appeared that directly referenced the crash, even including a note about the red car that had been in the intersection, a car I'd always tried to forget. I felt my stomach turn as I slowly realized the escape room was designed not just to challenge us, but to make us confront our worst fears and darkest secrets. The final clue was the worst. We were led into a small, dimly lit room with one solitary object in the center, a mirror. The walls were covered in eerie symbols, and I could hear my own breathing echoing in the silence. My heart was pounding in my chest as I approached the mirror. On its surface were words etched into the glass, "You're next." At first I thought it was just part of the game, a final dramatic touch to spook us. But as I looked closer, I saw something that stopped my breath. My own reflection was not how I remembered it. The face in the mirror was distorted, eyes wide with fear, as though something was watching me from within. And then, the reflection smiled, a cold, knowing smile that wasn't mine. I stepped back, panic rising in my chest. The others were still focused on the puzzle, unaware of what I had seen. I tried to call out to them, but the words stuck in my throat. The mirror's reflection was alive, shifting and twisting. The reflection of my friends was also changing, distorted, turning into shadowy figures. The room seemed to close in on me. My breath was shallow, my body trembling. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind us. A loud, metallic clank echoed through the room, sealing us in. The walls seemed to move, closing in on us slowly, as if the entire room was alive, feeding on our fear. I screamed, trying to push against the door, but it wouldn't budge. Panic swept over me as I realized that this was no longer a game. We were trapped. One by one, the puzzles we had solved began to replay in front of us. Only now they were more vivid, more sinister. The photograph of my family was back, but this time I noticed that everyone in the picture was looking directly at me, their eyes hollow and lifeless. The car accident memory replayed, but I was no longer in control of the scene. I could hear the screeching of tires, see the red car speeding toward me, its headlights blinding. Then the mirror flashed again, and the reflection changed, showing me in the car, trapped and screaming. My friends started to panic too, their faces contorted in terror. The room was no longer just a set of puzzles, it had become a living nightmare. I realized that the escape room was feeding off our fears, showing us our worst memories. our deepest regrets, and the things we tried to hide. I could hear their voices, distorted by fear, pleading to be let out, but the door remained locked. The mirror's reflection of me, no longer me, grinned wider, its eyes dark and unblinking. The smile in the reflection wasn't just unsettling, it was mocking. Time seemed to stretch, every second feeling like an eternity. I tried again to escape, but the more I struggled, the more the room seemed to shift, morphing into something even darker. The walls began to bleed, not with real blood, but with an eerie, black liquid that seemed to pulse with life. We were no longer in the escape room. We were inside our own personal nightmares, trapped by memories that refused to let go. I don't know how long we were there. When the door finally opened, I was the only one left. My friends were gone, vanished into the night as if they had never existed. The escape room was empty, the puzzles no longer there. But I could still hear the faint echo of their voices calling to me, trapped forever in the game. I walked out of the building, but as I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching me. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. Story 5. It was late, the kind of late when the world feels quiet and suspended in time. I was alone at home, curled up on the couch with my phone beside me, trying to unwind after a long week. I wasn't expecting any calls, so when my phone buzzed, I almost didn't bother looking at the screen. But then, I saw the name, Emma. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't heard her voice in years. Emma, my sister, had died in a car accident when I was just 19. She was gone, and this impossible call was about to shatter everything I thought I knew. I stared at the screen for a moment, disbelieving. The number was unlisted, but there was no mistaking it. It was her old phone number. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. Was it a wrong number? A prank? Maybe someone had found her phone and was using it for some strange reason. But as the phone kept ringing, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation deep in my stomach. What if it was really her? I answered the call with trembling hands, my voice barely a whisper. Hello. There was a long pause, a heavy silence on the other end, before the unmistakable voice of my sister spoke. Please help me, she said. Her voice was soft, weak, but it was undeniably hers, full of the same warmth and comfort I remembered from childhood. My blood ran cold as her words echoed through the phone. I froze, unable to speak. Emma. But that was impossible. She had died in that crash. She had been buried in a cemetery miles away. There was no logical explanation for what was happening, and yet, here I was, hearing her call for help, as if she were still alive. Emma. I managed to croak, my throat tightening with a mix of disbelief and dread. Is it really you? The line crackled, and for a moment I thought the call was dropping, but then her voice came through again. I'm trapped. Please, you have to find me. I don't know where I am. The words were disjointed, hurried, as though she was speaking through pain or fear. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind a whirlwind of confusion. This couldn't be happening, and there had to be some rational explanation. Yet every fiber of my being screamed that this wasn't a prank. I tried to calm myself, hoping it was some trick of the mind, a trick of the phone, anything other than what I was hearing. Emma, you're gone. You died. I was there at the funeral. Please, tell me this is some kind of joke. There was another long pause, longer than before, and then she spoke again. I'm not gone. Not really. But you have to hurry. I don't have much time. The words hung in the air like a cold weight. I felt my legs go weak, my vision swimming. This was impossible. There had to be an explanation, some kind of electrical glitch, a wrong number, anything that could make sense of this madness. But the voice on the other end wasn't just a random stranger. It was her. It was Emma. I knew it in my bones, and yet the fear creeping through me told me that I was on the edge of something I didn't understand. Where are you? I asked, my voice barely audible. Tell me where you are, Emma, and I'll come. I'll help you. Please. Her breathing was ragged now, like she was struggling to hold on. I don't know. It's dark. I can hear sounds, people, whispers. Her voice faltered. and I could hear her trying to steady herself. "It's cold. I can't move. Please find me, please." The word sent a chill straight through me. What was this? Was this some kind of warning? A message from beyond the grave? I rushed to grab my car keys, my body moving before my mind could fully process what was happening. "Emma, just stay on the line, okay? I'm coming. I'll find you." I could feel my pulse racing, adrenaline surging through my body as I grabbed my jacket and bolted out the door. The voice on the other end was growing quieter now, more distant, like a signal losing its strength. "Hurry," she whispered, and then silence. I stood in the driveway for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and terror. I dialed Emma's old number again, hoping beyond hope that I could reach her. The phone rang once, twice, and then went to voicemail. The beep sounded hollow, almost too final. I couldn't make sense of it. There was no rational explanation, but I couldn't ignore what I had just heard. I spent the next several hours driving around aimlessly, trying to process everything. I visited the crash site where Emma's car had gone off the road, hoping to find some clue, some answer. I drove past the cemetery where she was buried, hoping I would find something, anything that made sense. But nothing. There was no sign of Emma. She wasn't there. The only thing left was the memory of her voice on the phone, a chilling reminder that something inexplicable had just happened. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear her voice pleading for help, and I found myself questioning everything I knew about life, death, and the space in between. But the strangest thing happened. About a week later, I received another call. My heart stopped when I saw the number. It was her number again. I answered quickly, my voice shaking. "Emma, is that you?" This time there was no voice on the other end. No pleading, no familiar words, just silence. A long, suffocating silence. Then, a soft click. The call ended. I didn't know what to believe anymore. Was it her? Was it something else? All I knew was that the voice on the other end had been real, and it had left me with more questions than answers. I wasn't sure if I was being haunted or if something deeper, darker was at work. All I knew was that whatever I had heard on that call was not something I could ever forget. Story 6. It started like any other night. A group of friends and I were hanging out in my apartment, bored and looking for something to pass the time. We had already watched a couple of movies, played some video games, and had a few rounds of cards, but nothing was holding our attention. Then, someone brought up the elevator game. I had heard about it before, an urban legend that had made its rounds on the internet, but I didn't think it was anything more than just a creepy story. But my friends, as daring as ever, were insistent. They wanted to try it out, and admittedly the idea intrigued me. The rules were simple. You had to enter a building with at least 10 floors and ride an elevator. The goal was to reach the 10th floor, and then, supposedly, you'd end up in a different world. But there were a few catch-22s. First, you couldn't talk to anyone during the process. Second, you had to press the buttons in a specific order, and you had to be alone. If you followed all the steps correctly, you would end up in a place that was similar to the world you knew, but just off enough to feel wrong. We didn't take it too seriously after all. It was just a game. But the idea of doing something rebellious, something that felt like a secret, was appealing. We chose my apartment building, which had 12 floors. It was late, well after midnight, and the building was eerily quiet. We knew the rules: take the elevator alone, press the buttons in the prescribed order, and whatever you do, don't break the silence. So, with a mix of nerves and excitement, we gathered at the elevator. I went first, pressing the floor numbers in sequence: 4, 2, 6, 10, 5, 1, 9, 7, 8, and finally 10 again. The doors shut behind me, and I could hear the soft hum of the elevator as it ascended. I glanced at my phone, no signal, just like the legend said. The elevator jolted to a stop at the 10th floor, and the doors opened. The first thing that struck me was how familiar the floor looked. It was almost identical to mine, same gray carpet, same dull walls. But there was something wrong. The air felt heavier, colder. It was dead silent, not a sound to be heard, no hum of the building's ventilation system, or even the faintest echo of footsteps. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the hallway. The lights were dimmer here, casting long shadows across the floor, but what disturbed me the most was the lack of people. I had never seen a building so deserted at this hour. I stood there for a moment, unsure if I was imagining it, but then I heard a soft creak behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I walked down the hallway, my footsteps unnaturally loud against the otherwise stillness. I had expected this to be a trick of the mind, an unsettling experience, maybe, but not something that felt so deeply wrong. I turned the corner to look for my friends, but the hallway stretched on far longer than I remembered. The doors along the corridor were locked, and there were no windows. It felt like the building was larger here, somehow, with more floors, more rooms, places that shouldn't exist in this reality. My friends appeared next to me in the hallway. Their expressions mirrored mine, confused and worried. They had followed the same sequence of button presses, but when they stepped off the elevator, it was clear they felt the same disquiet I did. "This isn't right," whispered Mark, one of my friends, his voice low. His eyes scanned the hallway nervously. "Where are we?" We all looked around again. The hallway seemed to stretch on longer than it should have, and the air was colder than it should have been for a building this size. The sound of our footsteps echoed in an unnatural way. The light in the hallway flickered, casting an eerie glow over everything. The doors on either side were locked tight, but there was no sign of anyone. No movement, no signs of life. "Let's get back in the elevator," said Claire, her voice shaky. She was visibly unnerved, but there was a sense of urgency in her tone. We all agreed, and as we made our way back toward the elevator, we realized it wasn't where we had left it. The door to the elevator shaft was now closed. Panic set in. We all exchanged frantic glances. How could it have moved? We knew we hadn't touched it. "This is just a joke, right?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. My stomach twisted in knots, and the weight of the silence around us pressed down on me like a physical force. I reached for the door handle to the stairwell, hoping to find another way out. But when I turned it, it wouldn't budge. There was no way to leave. The building had trapped us. We were no longer in the same world we had known, and every part of this new reality felt wrong. The walls felt too close, the air too still. I looked down at my phone again, hoping for some signal, but still nothing. That's when we heard the sound. It was a low, guttural noise like a distant growl, far too deep to be human. It came from the hallway behind us, and it sent a chill down my spine. We froze, unsure of where it was coming from. The lights flickered again, and in the dim glow we saw something move in the distance. It wasn't a person, it was something else. A figure too tall, too unnatural, like something caught between dimensions. It lurched forward in jerky motions, its form barely discernible in the low light. It was getting closer. "What is that?" Mark whispered, his voice trembling. I had no answer. We turned and ran. The sound of our footsteps echoed loudly, the strange figure chasing us. It wasn't just a feeling anymore. The building was alive, it was changing, and it was taking us somewhere we weren't meant to go. We reached the elevator again, but this time the doors wouldn't open. It was like the building itself was preventing us from escaping. I slammed the button, but the doors stayed closed. We were trapped. Trapped. The growling noise grew louder. We could hear it moving behind us, its footsteps growing faster. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Silence returned, but it wasn't the same silence we'd experienced before. It was worse. The building was holding its breath, waiting for something. The door to the elevator finally opened. We all rushed inside, but the moment the doors closed, the elevator didn't move. It just stayed still. Then, slowly, the lights flickered, and the elevator descended. When the doors opened, we weren't in the building we recognized. We had entered a place we could never leave. We never tried the elevator game again. Story 7. The day of my grandfather's funeral was gray and heavy with sorrow. The church was filled with distant relatives, some I hadn't seen in years. Others I barely knew. My grandfather had always been the cornerstone of our family, and his passing felt like an undeniable shift in the world. I stood at the front, next to the casket, staring down at the man who had been larger than life to me. His worn hands, the ones that had taught me how to fish and fix things, now lay lifeless and still. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, something that should have been there to make everything feel right. As I stood there, lost in my thoughts, I noticed something strange. There was a man standing by the casket, slightly off to the side, dressed in a simple black suit. He wasn't anyone I recognized, and yet there was something about his presence that felt wrong. He wasn't crying or speaking to anyone, just standing there, his hands folded in front of him as if waiting for something. The way he observed the room, so quietly and intensely, made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I tried to ignore him at first, chalking it up to my nerves and the emotional weight of the day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong. After the service, as people began to filter out of the church, I walked over to where the man stood. I was still trying to make sense of his presence. Maybe he was a distant family friend or a colleague of my grandfather's, though I didn't recognize him. "Excuse me," I said, my voice tentative but firm. "Who are you? How did you know my grandfather?" The man didn't respond right away. He simply looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable, as if measuring me. I felt a strange chill run through me. There was something unsettling about his calm demeanor, something that felt out of place in the midst of grief. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and raspy, as though it hadn't been used in a long time. "He always said you'd be the one to figure it out," he whispered, barely audible over the hum of the crowd. I frowned, confused. What did he mean by that? I had no memory of my grandfather ever mentioning anything like that to me. I had always been close with him, but there were no secrets between us, at least, none that I knew of. The man continued to stare at me, his eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. And then, in a voice so soft it was almost a breath, he added, "He told me to wait for you here." The words sent a wave of unease through me. My grandfather had passed only days ago, and the idea of some stranger knowing personal details about him that even I wasn't privy to was enough to make my heart race. Who was this man? And how did he know about something so private? I took a step back, my mind swirling with questions I couldn't answer. Before I could speak, the man leaned in closer, his breath cold against my ear. "What do you remember the book in the attic? The one with the blue cover? He left it for you." I froze. My grandfather's attic was a place I hadn't ventured in years, not since I was a child. But there was a memory buried deep in my mind of a small, worn book with a blue cover, hidden behind boxes and old furniture. I hadn't thought about it in ages, but the image of it popped into my mind as clear as day. It was a book my grandfather had told me never to touch. He had said it contained family history, but that it wasn't for young eyes. I had always respected that boundary, never daring to open it. But now, with this stranger's words lingering in the air, I felt the weight of that old promise pressing down on me. Before I could respond, the man turned and started walking toward the back of the church, his steps slow and deliberate. I hesitated for a moment, caught between wanting to confront him and needing to understand more about what he had said. Something in his eyes told me he knew things about my family, about my grandfather, that I wasn't ready to learn. But the mention of the book, the way it seemed so deliberate, gnawed at me. I couldn't let it go. I followed him, feeling an odd mix of dread and curiosity. He walked as though he knew the building intimately, his movements fluid and precise, as though he had done this countless times before. As we reached the back door of the church, he turned toward me once more. "You'll find the answers in the attic," he said quietly, then slipped out into the parking lot without another word. I stood there, stunned and unsure of what to make of it all. I had questions, but no one around me seemed to notice the strange encounter. People were still gathering their things, whispering to one another, lost in their own worlds of grief and recollection. I returned to my car, feeling a strange sense of urgency rise within me. The words of the stranger replayed in my mind over and over again, the book in the attic. It felt like a key, unlocking something I had long since buried. I didn't know what I was about to find, but I knew I couldn't ignore it any longer. I drove home in a haze, my mind racing with possibilities. What was my grandfather hiding? And why had he left this cryptic message for me? When I finally reached my grandfather's house, the house that had been in the family for generations, I made my way upstairs to the attic. Dust and cobwebs greeted me as I opened the door, the familiar smell of old books and forgotten memories filling the air. I moved cautiously, my hand grazing the spines of books stacked in rows on wooden shelves. And then, there it was, the blue book, just as the stranger had described it. It sat on a small wooden table in the corner, half hidden beneath an old coat and a pile of yellowed papers. With trembling hands, I picked it up. The weight of it felt heavier than I remembered, as though it contained more than just pages. I opened the cover, and the first thing I saw was a single sentence written in my grandfather's handwriting: "You were always meant to know the truth." My heart stopped as I realized this was no ordinary book. It was a history of secrets, of things my grandfather had kept from me for my entire life. And now, somehow, it seemed that everything had led to this moment. Story 8. I had been traveling for work, and after a long day of meetings, I was eager to unwind in the hotel room I'd booked for the night. It was a small, modest hotel located on the outskirts of the city. I wasn't expecting luxury, but it was quiet, and that was all I really needed. The room was simple: 2 double beds, a small desk, and a bathroom tucked in the corner. What stood out to me was how ordinary everything seemed. Almost too ordinary, as if I had stepped into a place that no one had bothered to update in decades. When I first entered the room, I noticed that the door was solid and heavy, fitting snugly into its frame. The lock worked perfectly, and there was no sign of damage or wear. The bathroom door was also in good condition, though a bit smaller, tucked neatly in the far corner. I gave it no thought as I unpacked and settled in, eager to relax after a long day. I took a long shower to wash away the exhaustion and was ready to settle into bed for the night. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I had no reason for it, just a feeling that something was off. At first, I thought it was just the quiet of the hotel or maybe the hum of the air conditioning, but there was something else. It was a subtle feeling, like a presence in the room, even though I was completely alone. I lay there, eyes wide open, staring at the dark ceiling, trying to shake the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. I reached for my phone to check the time, but as I glanced around the room, I noticed something strange. The bathroom door was slightly ajar. I was sure I had closed it when I went to bed. A dim light from the hallway filtered through the crack, casting long shadows across the floor. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my overactive imagination, but then I heard an odd sound, a scraping noise coming from the bathroom. It was faint but persistent, like something or someone was moving behind the door. My heart began to race as I tried to rationalize the noise. Unable to stay in bed, I swung my legs over the side and stood up. The room felt colder now, the silence almost oppressive. I didn't want to investigate, but curiosity got the better of me. I slowly walked toward the bathroom, feeling like I was walking through molasses, as if the very air was holding me back. The scraping sound continued, and it became clearer as I got closer. It wasn't just a random noise, it sounded deliberate, like a scratching, a tugging, as though something was being moved behind the door. When I reached the door, I hesitated. My hand hovered over the knob, and I was struck by the sudden urge to turn back, to return to the safety of my bed. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind the door. With a deep breath, I pushed it open. The bathroom light flickered on, and the first thing I noticed was that everything seemed normal. The shower curtain was pulled back, the sink was empty, and there were no strange objects on the floor. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a faint outline in the far corner of the bathroom, near the edge of the wall. It was a narrow, almost imperceptible seam in the wallpaper, like a hidden door that had been covered up. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. I was sure it hadn't been there earlier. Without thinking, I moved toward the seam. The scraping noise had stopped, but my skin was crawling with a sense of dread. I pressed my fingers against the wall, and to my shock, it gave way with little resistance. The panel swung open to reveal a narrow, dark corridor that seemed to stretch into an endless void. I stood frozen for a moment, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The corridor was so dark that I couldn't make out anything beyond a few feet. It felt like the air was thicker there, as if the darkness itself was alive, breathing. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest. What kind of hotel had a secret door in the bathroom? Why had I never noticed it before? I took a step closer again, this time pressing my face against the darkened threshold, straining to see anything beyond. There was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just an oppressive, suffocating darkness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. I took another step back, unsure of what to do next. My instincts told me to close the door and pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't. The curiosity gnawed at me. I had to know what was behind that door. Against every ounce of reason, I found myself moving toward it, my hands trembling as I reached into the darkness. I took one hesitant step into the corridor. The floor beneath me felt uneven, like I was walking on a surface that wasn't quite solid. The air was cold now, like I had crossed into a different space entirely. The corridor was narrow, and as I moved deeper into it, I realized that the walls were lined with old, faded wallpaper exactly like the one in the bathroom. But there were no windows, no exit. It was as if I had stepped into a different part of the hotel, one that didn't exist on any floor plan. My heart raced as the overwhelming sense of wrongness settled over me. I couldn't stay there. I turned around quickly, retracing my steps back to the bathroom door. As I stepped out of the corridor, I slammed the door shut, my pulse still pounding. I stood there for several moments, trying to calm myself, but the darkness from the hidden passageway clung to me. The hotel room, which had felt so safe only hours ago, now seemed suffocating, the walls closing in. After a long while, I convinced myself it was just a dream or a figment of my imagination. But I knew deep down that it wasn't. The door, the corridor, the feeling of being watched, none of it made sense, yet it felt entirely real. I tried to get some sleep, but it was impossible. The unsettling presence in the room refused to let me rest. The next morning, I packed up and left as quickly as I could, eager to escape the hotel. When I went to check out, I asked the receptionist about the layout of the building, but they seemed confused. "There's no secret door in any of the rooms," she said with a smile, as if I were joking. But I knew what I had seen. As I stepped outside into the daylight, the weight of the hotel lifted, but the memory of that hidden door stayed with me. I've never been able to shake the feeling that something was watching me that night. That door wasn't just an architectural oddity, it was a gateway to something much darker. I never went back to that hotel, and I've never spoken about it to anyone. But I know that whatever lies behind that door is still out there, waiting. Story 9. It started like any other day. I woke up to the sound of my alarm blaring, groggy and disoriented, and rolled out of bed to begin my morning routine. My roommate Sarah wasn't in the kitchen, but that wasn't unusual. She often left early for work, and sometimes I didn't see her until later in the evening. But when I came back to the apartment after a long day, something felt off. The apartment was eerily quiet, and the air felt thicker, as if something had changed in the space while I was gone. At first, I thought maybe Sarah was just out with friends, but as the evening stretched on, I began to wonder. Her things were still in the apartment, her shoes by the door, her coat hanging in the hallway, but there was no sign of her. I texted her, but there was no reply. I assumed maybe she had gone out without telling me, though that wasn't typical. It wasn't until the next morning that I started to get truly worried. Her bed was untouched, and the bathroom had been left exactly as it had been the night before. It was as if she had vanished in the middle of the night, without a trace. I searched the apartment, checking every room, opening every closet and drawer. There was no sign of struggle, nothing seemed out of place. The only thing that stood out was her bedroom door, which was slightly ajar. When I pushed it open, I was met with a strange sight. Her room was in perfect order. but there was something odd about the way her desk was positioned. The chair was slightly askew, and a small, leather-bound journal sat on top of her desk, as if she had left it there intentionally. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I picked up the journal, the cover cold in my hands. It was unusual, plain but old, with no markings on the front. As I opened it, I found that the pages were filled with strange drawings, detailed sketches of the apartment, the layout of the rooms, and in some cases, unsettling images of figures standing in the corners or hidden behind furniture. At first, I thought it might just be a creative project, but the longer I looked at the drawings, the more I realized something was wrong. The sketches weren't just random doodles. They seemed almost predatory, as if someone had been observing the apartment for a long time. One drawing stood out from the rest. It depicted the living room, but the figure in the corner of the room was not a person. It was a dark, shadowy shape with glowing eyes, watching the couch where I often sat. I flipped the page, my heart beginning to race, and saw more images, closer views of the shadows in the apartment, with markings that I didn't recognize. There were symbols drawn along the edges of the pages, some of them overlapping, others bleeding into the spaces between the drawings. A chill ran down my spine as I continued flipping through the pages. Toward the end of the journal, I found a single note written in block letters. My name was scrawled across the top, and the words that followed made my blood run cold. "You're next." My hands shook as I read the note again, as if the words were somehow etched into my mind. The journal had been hidden, and it seemed to suggest that Sarah knew something about me, something about this apartment, something about whatever had happened to her. But what did it all mean? I sat down on the bed, the journal still in my hands, trying to piece together what I had discovered. The note, the drawings, everything pointed to something sinister. I couldn't ignore the feeling that Sarah hadn't just left. She had been taken, or perhaps something had driven her to leave without a word. But why had she left the journal behind? What was she trying to tell me? And why did it seem like whatever happened to her was now coming for me? I spent the rest of the day looking over the apartment again, but there was nothing new to find. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed impossible that Sarah could have just disappeared without a trace. I contacted the building management, asking if anyone had seen her, but they claimed they hadn't. I reached out to her friends, but no one had heard from her either. It was as if she had simply vanished, and the silence that followed only deepened my dread. As night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The apartment, once a comfortable space, now felt oppressive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see movement in the corners of the room. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind outside made my heart race. It was impossible to ignore the fact that I had no idea where Sarah was or what had happened to her. But what troubled me even more was the idea that whatever had taken her was still out there, and now it was waiting for me. I stayed up late that night, flipping through the journal again, searching for anything that might give me a clue about what to do next. As I reached the last page, I found another drawing, this one different from the rest. It showed the apartment again, but this time it wasn't empty. There were figures, people, faces I didn't recognize standing in every room, surrounding me. And at the center of it all, a tall, dark shape stood just behind the door to the bedroom, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. I slammed the journal shut, my mind racing. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming now, and I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed a bag and headed for the door, but as I reached the hallway, something made me stop. The apartment door was slightly open, just enough to reveal a shadow moving on the other side. I froze. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Was it Sarah? Had she come back? Or was it something else? I took a deep breath and stepped toward the door, my hands clammy with sweat. But as I reached for the handle, I heard something, a faint sound, a whisper coming from the other side of the door. It was Sarah's voice, but she wasn't calling my name. She was saying, "Don't come in. It's already too late." I stood frozen in place, the door trembling in my hand. I had no idea what to do anymore. Whatever had taken Sarah was waiting for me now. Story 10. I had always considered myself a quiet observer of the world around me, content to watch life unfold through the comfort of my apartment window. It was a simple life, filled with the mundane, the hum of city traffic, the occasional shout of a street vendor, and the soft murmur of voices drifting up from the streets below. I never imagined that my peaceful routine would be shattered by something as horrifying as what I saw that night. It was just after midnight when I first noticed the shadows moving in the alley across the street. At first, I thought it was just another fight or an argument, something not uncommon in this part of the city. But then the noise stopped. It wasn't the usual shouting or swearing. It was the sudden silence that caught my attention. Curiosity got the best of me, and I leaned closer to the window, peering through the curtains. What I saw made my stomach drop. A man, his face twisted in panic, struggling against someone who was clearly not a stranger to him. The other figure, tall and cloaked in darkness, held a knife. I watched, unable to look away, as the blade sliced through the man's chest with terrifying precision. His body went limp, and the figure dropped him like a sack of potatoes, stepping back to look at their work. I felt my heart race as I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. I had just witnessed a murder, a brutal killing that I couldn't possibly have imagined. I froze, my breath shallow, as the full weight of what I had just seen settled in. I wanted to call the police, to tell someone, but fear gripped me. What if the killer saw me? What if they knew I had been watching? It was a terrifying thought, and it made me hesitate longer than I should have. But then I remembered that I had a responsibility. I needed to speak up, to do something before it was too late. I grabbed my phone, dialing the emergency number with shaking hands. The operator's voice came through, clear but distant. I tried to explain what I had seen, my words stumbling over each other as I recounted the details of the man and the killer. But just as I was about to give my address, something outside caught my eye. The killer, he was looking directly at me. He was standing in the same alley, his head tilted back, his gaze locked on my window. A chill ran down my spine, and I felt my throat tighten. There was no mistaking it, he knew I had seen him. He was staring right at me, as if daring me to do something. I dropped my phone, the call disconnected, and I backed away from the window in a blind panic. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. But all I could think was that I wasn't safe. The killer knew I was a witness, and I was certain that he would come for me. My apartment, once a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I had no way of knowing if he was already on his way up to my door, or if he was waiting for me to make the first move. Hours passed, but the fear never subsided. I sat in the dark, not daring to turn on a light or make a sound. Every creak of the building felt like the footsteps of the killer coming closer. Each shadow cast in the dim light of the street lamp outside seemed to grow longer, darker, and more sinister. My mind played tricks on me, and I imagined his face in every reflection, in every passing shadow. What if he was already inside the building, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake? The worst part was that I didn't know what to do. I couldn't just leave. I didn't even know if I could trust anyone. The police would be an obvious choice, but what if they thought I was lying? What if the killer had already covered his tracks, made sure there were no traces of his crime? I was just a witness after all. What if my testimony wasn't enough to stop him? What if I was the one who became the next victim? I thought about leaving the apartment, about finding somewhere safe to go, but I knew that was impossible. If the killer wanted to find me, he would. And even if I ran, how far could I really go? How long would I be able to keep running before he caught up to me? I realized then that I had two choices. I could stay and face him, or I could leave and hope for the best. Neither option felt safe, but staying felt like the death sentence. The next morning I woke to the sound of sirens, a distant, muffled noise that seemed to fade in and out. I peered through the curtains, careful not to make myself visible. The street was bustling as usual, but something was different. There were more police cars than I'd ever seen on this block, their flashing lights illuminating the morning fog. It wasn't until I heard the unmistakable voice of an officer shouting through a megaphone that I realized something else. The murder I had witnessed had been discovered. Someone had found a body. My heart sank. Had I done enough to help? Or had I just sealed my own fate by becoming involved? The realization hit me then I was a witness. I was part of the story now, a thread woven into something much larger and far more dangerous than I had ever expected. I had no choice but to step forward, but every instinct in me screamed to run. My phone buzzed, breaking me from my thoughts, and I saw that I had several missed calls. I hesitated before dialing back, unsure of what to expect, but then a voice I didn't recognize answered. "Is this the witness?" The voice asked, cold and sharp. "We know you saw us. We know you're the one who's been watching, and now you'll pay the price." I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The voice was low, distorted, but the threat was unmistakable. They were coming for me. I had no doubt now that the killer wasn't just a murderer, they were someone who had no intention of letting me live to tell the story. I hung up quickly, my hands trembling as I stared at the phone. What had I gotten myself into? I wasn't safe here and I couldn't stay. But I also couldn't leave without knowing who I was really dealing with. Was the killer watching me right now? Would he be waiting for me to make a mistake? I glanced out the window again, half expecting to see him standing in the alley, waiting for me. The streets were still crowded with police and curious onlookers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being hunted. The waiting game had begun, and I was no longer just a witness. I was the next target. Story 11. When I first moved into the old house, I was excited about the fresh start. It was a quaint two-story home in a quiet neighborhood with creaky wooden floors and walls that seemed to breathe with age. The price was right, and it had so much potential, or so I told myself. I spent the first few days unpacking, painting the walls, and getting everything into place. It wasn't until nightfall that the house began to feel a little different. That's when I first heard it, a faint whisper, like the wind passing through the cracks in the walls. At first, I didn't think much of it. Old houses like this were known for settling, and I assumed it was just the wind whistling through the gaps. The house had a lot of character: uneven floors, drafty rooms, and doors that didn't always close properly. I brushed it off, telling myself that the house was just adjusting to being lived in again. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, and they didn't sound like the wind anymore. I remember one evening I was sitting on the couch reading a book when I heard it again. At first, it was barely noticeable, a soft murmur coming from the hallway. I tried to ignore it, but then the sound grew louder, clearer. It was like someone was speaking just on the other side of the wall, too faint to make out, but there. I stood up, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. It was as if the walls themselves were alive, pulsating with a sound I couldn't explain. The next day, I decided to investigate. I walked along the hallway, pressing my ear against the walls, trying to pinpoint where the whispers were coming from. I couldn't find a source, no cracks in the plaster or air vents that could account for the noise. But as I stood there, straining to listen, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The whispers weren't just random sounds. They were saying my name. Emma. The voice was faint but unmistakable. I jumped back, my heart racing. There was no one else in the house. My mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a neighbor. Maybe it was the house settling again. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. That night, I lay in bed, wide awake, listening for any sign of the whispers. The house was silent for hours, and I began to convince myself it was all in my head. But just as I started to drift off, I heard it again. Emma. The voice was soft and low, as if it was calling me, trying to get my attention. I sat up in bed, my body rigid with fear. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something in this house, something I couldn't explain, and it was calling me. I decided to do some research the next day. I went online and searched for anything about the house's history. I found that it had been built in the early 1900s by a family who had lived there for generations. The house had changed owners a few times, but nothing unusual had been reported, at least, nothing that could explain the whispers. But then, as I dug deeper, I found a strange entry in a local history forum. It was a post from someone claiming to have lived in the house decades ago. They mentioned strange noises, whispers, and odd occurrences that seemed to happen in the dead of night. The post ended with a chilling line, "I don't know who or what is calling, but I'm sure it's not human." That sent a chill down my spine. I wasn't the only one who had experienced this. I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't alone. The whispers had been here long before I arrived. But what did they want? Why were they calling my name? I decided to confront it. The next evening, I stood in the hallway, my heart pounding as I waited for the voices to return. I didn't know what I was hoping for, maybe an explanation, maybe an answer. But when the whispers started again, they were more urgent, more insistent. "Emma, come closer." The voice seemed to come from behind the wall in front of me. I felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to get closer. But before I could move, I heard another whisper, this time from the opposite side of the hallway. "Don't listen to it." I froze. The voices weren't just calling my name anymore. They were arguing with each other, as if two different entities were fighting for my attention. I took a step back, my breath shallow and quick. This wasn't just a strange sound, it was something far more unsettling, something that felt alive, something that wanted something from me. The next few days were a blur of confusion and fear. The whispers continued, but now they weren't just isolated events. They followed me from room to room, seeping through the walls no matter where I went. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't focus on anything except the voices. They were always there, always calling my name, sometimes in soft whispers, sometimes in sharp, urgent tones. "Come closer, Emma. Let us show you." I reached my breaking point when I found a new message scrawled on the bathroom mirror one morning. "It's time." The message was written in a dark, smeared substance that looked like ink, but when I wiped it away, it came back almost immediately. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just condensation or a trick of the light, but deep down I knew something was wrong. The house was changing, shifting around me in ways I couldn't understand. That night I decided to confront the voices once and for all. I stood in the center of the living room, every nerve in my body on edge, waiting for them to speak. And they did. The whispers started again, this time louder than ever. "Emma, it's time." The voice seemed to come from every corner of the room, surrounding me, suffocating me. I could hear the desperation in the voices now, and I realized that whatever was calling me wasn't trying to hurt me, it was trying to make me understand something that had been hidden for years. Then, with a sudden rush of sound, the whispers stopped. Silence filled the house, thick and heavy. For the first time in days, I felt an eerie calm. I waited for a moment, unsure of what would happen next, and then I heard one last whisper, softer than the rest. "The walls remember everything, Emma. The walls remember you." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I wasn't sure what the walls remembered or what they wanted from me. But I knew one thing for certain: the house had secrets, and I had just scratched the surface. Story 12. The house next door had always been a quiet one. For years it had stood empty, the lawn overgrown with weeds, and the windows dusted with the residue of time. I remembered when the neighbors, the Harringtons, lived there. They were a nice family, always friendly, but they packed up and moved away almost 5 years ago, leaving the house behind as if they were never coming back. At first I hadn't thought much of it, assuming the place was just another empty property waiting to be sold. But then something strange started happening. Every night at exactly 10 p.m., the lights in the Harringtons' house flickered on. It wasn't just one light or a random bulb here and there, it was the entire house. The living room lights, the kitchen, even the upstairs hallway, each room illuminated in perfect unison. It had become a nightly ritual, like the house was alive with light, even though no one had lived there for years. I initially thought it was just a malfunction with the electrical system, maybe a short or a glitch. But the consistency of it bothered me, especially when it went on for weeks and then months without any explanation. At first, I didn't know how to explain it. I tried reaching out to the property management company that handled the house, asking if they had any information on why the lights turned on like that. The response was always the same: they hadn't been able to find any tenants, and the place was still for sale. I found it odd, considering the energy bills and maintenance costs for a house that stood vacant. But I figured it was probably a technical issue, and I let it go. However, as the nights passed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about it. The lights didn't just flicker, they seemed deliberate, almost as if someone was watching me. One evening, after weeks of this strange occurrence, I decided to knock on the door. I figured I would at least meet the new tenants or someone who could explain the odd lighting. I wasn't expecting much, probably just a neighbor or a real estate agent, but something inside me told me I had to do it. The house was too close, too familiar to keep ignoring it. I grabbed my coat and walked up the driveway, my footsteps crunching on the frost-covered grass as I approached the front door. When I knocked, there was no response. I waited for a few seconds, then knocked again, a little louder this time. The stillness of the air felt heavy, as if the entire street was holding its breath. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the door creaked open on its own. I froze. The door didn't open by much, just a crack, but enough for me to see inside. The lights were on, just as they always were at 10 p.m. The living room looked untouched, no furniture, no sign of life, just an empty, cold space bathed in artificial light. I pushed the door open slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. The house smelled musty, as if it had been abandoned for years, yet the lights burned brightly, illuminating every corner. I called out softly, "Hello." No answer. My voice echoed eerily through the empty rooms. I stepped inside, feeling an odd pull toward the darkened hallway leading further into the house. It was as if the house itself was drawing me in, urging me to explore, to see what lay hidden within. But I stopped myself before I could take another step. Instead, I made my way to the living room. The walls were bare, stripped of the family photos and the familiar pictures that used to hang there when the Harringtons lived here. The furniture was gone, the carpet worn down to a dull gray. But the lights were on, and there was no sign of anyone having moved out or in. It felt like a hollow shell, a house that had been forgotten but still somehow alive with the glow of electric light. My eyes fell to the stairs, which led up to the second floor. I could have sworn I saw a shadow move in the corner of my vision, but when I looked up, the stairs were empty. Suddenly, I felt a wave of cold rush over me, a chill that made the hairs on my neck stand up. I backed out of the house, my mind racing, my hands trembling. What was going on here? Why had no one told me the house had been rented or sold? Why did the lights turn on every night, even though the place had been empty for years? I walked back to my front door, my mind buzzing with questions. It wasn't until I got home that I realized I hadn't seen a single moving box, no sign of a real estate agent, no indication that anyone had moved in. It didn't make sense. There was no one in the house, and yet the lights were still on, just like always. I couldn't understand it, but one thing was clear: there was something wrong with that house. Something that didn't add up. The next night I stayed up late, watching from my window as the clock approached 10 p.m. As the seconds ticked by, I felt a strange tension build in the pit of my stomach. Just like clockwork, the lights flickered on in the Harringtons' house. This time I grabbed my jacket and headed back outside. I walked down the street, my eyes fixed on the house, waiting. When I reached the front porch, I hesitated, but something inside me urged me to go back in. This time, I wasn't going to leave without answers. I knocked again, louder this time, but the door didn't open. I tried the handle locked, just as I expected, but the lights inside stayed on. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. For a moment, I thought I heard something faint, a whisper, perhaps, or the sound of footsteps. My heart raced as I stepped back from the door, my mind spinning. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was going on inside that house wasn't something that could be easily explained. And then, as I turned to leave, I glanced up at the window. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought I saw a figure standing there. A face, just behind the glass, staring out into the night. But when I blinked, it was gone. The house was empty once more, and the lights were still on. Story 13. It was a Saturday morning when I stumbled upon the painting at the garage sale. The weather was perfect for browsing, crisp and clear, and I was enjoying a quiet day off, looking for something to distract me. The sale was set up in a small suburban neighborhood with tables full of old furniture, trinkets, and knickknacks. Most of it didn't interest me, but something about the large, ornate frame on the table caught my eye. As I approached, I realized it was a portrait of a woman, painted in rich, muted tones. The brushstrokes were smooth, and the colors were so vivid that the woman almost seemed alive, her image frozen in time. There was something unsettling about the woman's eyes. At first glance, they appeared normal, deep brown, almond-shaped, with a hint of softness. But as I looked closer, I began to feel a strange sensation. It was as if her eyes were too intense, too penetrating. They seemed to pull me in, and I couldn't look away. The longer I stared, the more her gaze felt like it was following me, moving with me. I shook my head, dismissing the feeling as nothing more than my imagination. After all, it was just a painting. I decided to buy it, thinking it might add an interesting touch to my apartment. I hung the painting in my living room that evening, directly across from the couch where I usually sat. It fit perfectly with the rest of my decor, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of satisfaction with the space. But as the hours passed, I began to feel uneasy. No matter where I sat in the room, I couldn't escape her eyes. They seemed to track me, never leaving my movements. I convinced myself that it was just the way the painting was done, that the positioning of her gaze, the shading, and the angle made it appear as though she was always looking at me. Over the next few days, the sensation grew stronger. Every time I walked into the living room, I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone was watching me. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard to shake the feeling. I moved the painting to different parts of the room, hoping that the change in angle might ease the unsettling feeling. But no matter where I placed it, her eyes followed me. The more I tried to avoid looking at her, the more impossible it became. It was as though she was drawing me in, forcing me to confront her unblinking stare. At night, the feeling became even worse. I would lie in bed, trying to fall asleep, but I could feel her presence in the room. I couldn't see the painting from my bed, but I knew it was there, silently watching me. My dreams began to be filled with strange, fleeting images of the woman, her face distorted, her eyes wide and unblinking. I woke up more than once in the middle of the night, heart racing, as if I had just narrowly escaped something. The line between the waking world and my dreams started to blur. I found myself avoiding the living room altogether, preferring to spend my time in the kitchen or bedroom. It wasn't long before I began to notice changes in my daily life. I started feeling like I wasn't alone, even when I was home by myself. I'd hear faint sounds, footsteps, whispers, or the sound of something shifting, though I could never find the source. At times I thought I saw her in the corner of my vision, standing just outside the frame of the painting, as if she were about to step out of it and into the room. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was as though the painting had a life of its own, that it wasn't just a portrait, but something more sinister. One afternoon, I invited a friend over for coffee, hoping that spending time with someone else might break the strange hold the painting seemed to have over me. We sat on the couch chatting, but as the conversation wore on, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that the woman's eyes were staring at me. Mid-sentence, I caught my friend looking at the painting, her eyes wide. "Is it just me?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Or does it feel like she's watching us?" I froze. It was exactly how I'd been feeling all along, but I had been too afraid to say anything. I nodded slowly, afraid to voice the words that had been haunting me for days. "I thought it was just me," I admitted, "but it feels like she's following me around the room." My friend didn't say anything else, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. The rest of our time together passed in silence, the conversation feeling forced and strained. When she left, I couldn't help but feel a wave of relief wash over me, but it didn't last long. As soon as the door closed behind her, I felt the familiar sensation creeping in. The eyes were watching me again, colder and more intense than ever. That night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I was exhausted, mentally and physically, from the constant unease that had been building up inside me. I decided to get rid of the painting. I couldn't stand the thought of it lingering in my apartment any longer. I wrapped it up carefully, ready to drop it off at a thrift store the next day. But just as I was about to leave, I heard something soft and almost imperceptible, like a whisper. It seemed to come from the direction of the painting. I walked slowly toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder than it had before, and as I approached the painting, I noticed something strange. The woman's eyes, her pupils had changed. They were no longer simply staring at me, they were pleading. The once still portrait had shifted, subtly, and now it seemed to be filled with something desperate, something terrifying. I couldn't take it anymore. Without thinking, I grabbed the painting, ran out of the apartment, and drove straight to a nearby lake. There, I tossed it into the water, watching as the waves slowly swallowed it whole. As I drove back home, I felt the weight lifting from my chest, as if the oppressive gaze of the painting had finally been lifted. But I still wonder sometimes. As I lay in bed, I catch myself glancing toward the empty wall where the painting once hung. I try not to think about what might have happened if I hadn't thrown it away, or if it might somehow find its way back to me. And deep down, I can't shake the feeling that the woman's eyes are still watching, just out of sight, waiting for the moment when I let my guard down. Story 14. It was a typical quiet night when the knock on my door startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the hour was far too late for deliveries, almost midnight to be exact. I hesitated, my hand still on the handle, when I noticed a small package sitting at my doorstep. No address, no return label, just a plain brown box, the kind you'd see at a post office, sealed tight with simple brown tape. My heart thudded in my chest as I bent down to pick it up, the coolness of the box sending an odd chill up my arm. I brought it inside and set it on the kitchen counter, staring at it for a long time. The silence of the house seemed to grow louder, the shadows in the corners of the room suddenly more pronounced. My mind raced. Was it a mistake? A wrong delivery? Or something else? I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Still, my curiosity won out. I sliced open the tape with a knife, lifting the lid cautiously. Inside was a crumpled note, hastily scrawled in black ink. It read only one word: run. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I glanced around the kitchen, the light overhead casting long, soft shadows against the walls. The note felt heavy in my hand, the ink smudged in places, as if it had been written in a hurry, or maybe fear. I turned the note over, hoping for some explanation, some clue as to who had sent it, but there was nothing else. Just that single, chilling command: run. A sudden gust of wind outside rattled the window pane, snapping me out of my stupor. The house was eerily quiet again, but my nerves were on high alert. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain why, but I was compelled to glance outside, to check the darkness beyond my window. That's when I saw it, something or someone standing just outside, barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. But no, there was definitely someone there. A shadowy figure standing just beyond the edge of my yard, unmoving. My heart rate quickened. Was it a passerby, or was this person waiting, watching me? I leaned closer to the window, my fingers gripping the edge of the curtain. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring, its presence undeniable even through the darkened glass. A wave of panic hit me, and I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair in my haste. The note's single word echoed in my mind: run. I couldn't think straight. My head was spinning as I fought the urge to bolt, to hide, but I knew I couldn't stay here. Something was wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room, looking for some way out, some way to escape. I grabbed my phone from the kitchen counter, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. But the line went dead. The screen blinked once and then showed no signal. My breath hitched, my pulse racing. Was someone messing with my phone, or was there something more sinister at play? I ran to the back door, checking the locks, making sure everything was secure. The house was old, and some of the windows stuck or wouldn't lock properly. But the back door thankfully was solid, the bolts firm. I grabbed a jacket from the coat rack and pulled it on, still glancing out the window, still watching the shadowed figure across the yard. They hadn't moved. But something in the air, the stillness of it all, told me that they were aware of me watching. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to leave. I had no idea what this was, who was out there, or what was going on, but the only instinct that mattered now was survival. I grabbed my keys and ran for the front door, praying that the figure would remain stationary, that I could make it out of the house before anything happened. As I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap to the face. My breath came out in quick, jagged gasps as I ran down the steps and onto the path. The street was dark. Only a few houses down the road had lights on. There was no one else in sight. My shoes slapped the concrete as I ran, my feet pounding against the pavement. I dared not look back, but I could feel eyes on me, burning into my back. I ran for what felt like miles, the streets growing more unfamiliar the further I went. Every sound, every rustle in the distance made my heart skip a beat. I glanced over my shoulder once, my body trembling with fear. There was no one following me, at least, not that I could see. But the feeling of being watched only intensified. I eventually stopped in the middle of a quiet, unfamiliar neighborhood, my chest heaving, trying to catch my breath. I was far from home now, and I had no idea where I was. The streetlights here seemed dimmer, casting long, ghostly shadows across the pavement. I found a bench by the sidewalk and sat, trying to calm myself, my mind racing. What was going on? Who had sent the package? Why did they want me to run? I checked my phone again. This time there was a signal, but when I opened my messages, there was nothing new. No missed calls, no texts. I dialed my best friend's number, hoping to hear a familiar voice. The phone rang for what felt like forever, but then it clicked. The call didn't go through. It was like the entire world was closing in on me. I stood up, my instincts screaming at me to keep moving, to keep running. But the moment I did, I saw it. In the reflection of a nearby shop window, I saw the figure again, closer this time, almost directly behind me. My blood ran cold. There was no way they could have followed me this quickly. My pulse surged as I spun around, only to find the street completely empty. It was then I realized something far worse. I hadn't seen them move. They hadn't walked up to me or even shifted positions, but they had appeared in the window, as though they had always been there, waiting, watching. Story 15. I had always been a fan of antiques, especially jewelry. So when I stumbled across a stall at the local flea market selling vintage pieces, I couldn't resist. Among the worn bracelets and tarnished necklaces, one item caught my eye, a silver ring, intricately designed with dark stones set in a Gothic pattern. It was beautiful, almost hypnotic. The vendor, an elderly woman with a knowing smile, told me it was a rare find, a true antique. I didn't hesitate. I bought it on the spot, thrilled to own such a unique piece. At first, the ring was nothing more than a beautiful accessory. I wore it proudly, admiring its craftsmanship every time I glanced at my finger. But soon I began to notice small, unsettling things. Objects around my apartment would be out of place, nothing major, just little shifts. A book that had been on the shelf would be on the floor, or a mug I'd left on the kitchen counter would be on the table. At first I dismissed it. I was busy, maybe just forgetful. But as the days passed, these occurrences grew more frequent, more impossible to ignore. One evening, as I sat in my living room reading, I felt a cold draft brush against my skin. I turned to look, but the window was closed. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the old house settling. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, fleeting but unmistakable, darted across the wall. I jumped up, heart pounding, that the room was empty. I looked at the ring on my finger, an inexplicable chill crawling up my spine. It couldn't be, could it? It had to be a coincidence, right? The strange occurrences escalated. I began having vivid, disturbing dreams every night. In these dreams, I was in a dark, dimly lit room. the air thick with tension. A man stood in front of me, his face obscured, but I could feel his malice radiating. Every night, the dream felt more real, and I started waking up drenched in sweat, heart racing, the weight of a presence lingering in the air. I never told anyone about the dreams. They seemed too bizarre, too surreal. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were connected to the ring. I decided to do some research, hoping to put my mind at ease. I traced the ring back to the vendor, who seemed to know surprisingly little about its history. When I dug deeper, I discovered the dark truth. The ring had once belonged to a notorious murderer from the 19th century, a man named Gregory Hawk. Hawk had been infamous for a series of brutal killings that had shaken the town to its core. He was said to have worn the ring on the night of his final murder spree. After his capture and execution, the ring had disappeared, only to resurface in the flea market years later. I couldn't believe what I was reading. The more I uncovered, the more the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The nightmares, the strange occurrences, they weren't coincidences. The ring wasn't just an antique, it was a relic tied to a dark past. I wondered if the ring had somehow retained the spirit of its former owner. Could it be cursed? Could his violent energy still linger, passing on to anyone who wore it? The thought sent a wave of nausea through me. I felt trapped, as if I had unwittingly invited something sinister into my life. The next night, as I sat on the couch, I felt an overwhelming compulsion to take off the ring. I pulled at it, but it wouldn't budge. My fingers, slick with sweat, couldn't get a firm grip. Panic surged within me as I tried to twist it off, but it felt as though the ring was growing tighter around my finger, as if it were alive, fighting against me. My heart raced as the room seemed to grow colder, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching out like dark fingers. I grabbed a pair of pliers, my hand shaking, and tried again. This time the ring finally slid off, but as I pulled it off, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my hand. It was as though the ring had left a mark, an imprint that wouldn't fade. When I looked down, I noticed the skin around my finger had turned an unnatural shade of blue, and a faint, jagged scar had appeared beneath it. I stared at the scar, horrified, as a voice seemed to echo in my mind, whispering the name Gregory Hawk. I stumbled backward, the ring clutched tightly in my hand, realizing that I was no longer dealing with just an old piece of jewelry. That night, the dreams returned, but this time they were different. Instead of simply witnessing the shadowy figure of Gregory Hawk, I became him. I felt his anger, his rage coursing through my body. I could feel his twisted, murderous intentions surging inside me, taking control. I tried to fight it, but his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. His emotions became my own, and I felt his desires a deep, insatiable need to kill, to destroy. When I awoke, I was drenched in sweat, my body shaking uncontrollably. The sensation of his hatred still lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over me. Desperate, I returned to the flea market, hoping to find the woman who had sold me the ring. I found her at the same stall, her wrinkled face creased in a knowing smile when she saw me. "You've learned the truth, haven't you?" she asked, her voice low and unsettling. I nodded, my stomach churning. "This ring," I began, my voice trembling, "it's cursed, isn't it? It belonged to a murderer." She nodded slowly. "It has passed through many hands, each person falling victim to the darkness it carries. It's not just a ring, it's a tether. A piece of a soul, bound by violence. It will never truly let go of its owner." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but I was too afraid. "What can I do?" I whispered. The woman looked at me with pity, her eyes shadowed with sorrow. "You must return it," she said. "You must give it back to the earth where it belongs. Only then can its curse be lifted." But as I left the market, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ring had already taken too much from me. The darkness had already started to seep into my life, and no matter how far I ran, it would always follow. The ring wasn't just an object, it was a part of something much deeper, something far more sinister. And now, I was bound to it. Story 16. It was a rainy Thursday afternoon when I stumbled across the case file. I worked as a junior analyst for a small law firm, mostly handling mundane tasks like organizing evidence, reviewing contracts, and occasionally doing research for ongoing investigations. That day, the office was quieter than usual, the hum of the fluorescent lights above me the only sound filling the air. As I was sorting through some old case files, one particular file caught my eye. It was thick, marked with the word "unsolved" in bold red letters, and had been tucked away in the back of the filing cabinet like it had been forgotten for years. I opened it out of curiosity, thinking it would be a run-of-the-mill cold case. The file contained police reports, witness statements, and photographs of the crime scene. The case was about a series of home invasions in a nearby suburb. The victims were all middle-aged couples who lived alone, and the crimes seemed random at first. There was no obvious pattern between the locations or the times of the break-ins, but each home had been ransacked, and in one particularly disturbing case, the wife had been found dead. The more I read, the more I felt a strange sense of familiarity. Something about the victims seemed oddly personal, but I couldn't quite place it. As I dug deeper into the file, I noticed a strange connection between the victims. They all lived in the same area, within a few miles of each other. And oddly enough, they had all attended the same neighborhood gathering at one point, an annual block party that took place a few years ago. I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized that I too had attended that same party. The thought of the victims being so close to me, having crossed paths with people I knew, sent a knot of unease into my stomach, but I shrugged it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. Still, something tugged at the back of my mind, a feeling I couldn't quite shake. I decided to visit the police station the next day. I needed more details about the victims in the case, something that wasn't in the file. The officer I spoke to was reluctant at first, but after a few minutes of polite conversation, he seemed to loosen up. He confirmed that there were no signs of forced entry into the homes, almost like the victims had let their attacker in willingly. Theories about the suspect ranged from an ex-lover to a serial burglar, but there were no concrete leads. The officer gave me a strange look when I asked about the block party, but he didn't say much. His eyes lingered on me for a moment before he excused himself. When I returned to the office, I couldn't stop thinking about the case. The connections kept growing stronger in my mind. It was the details that bothered me, little things that seemed insignificant but were starting to pile up. One of the victims had been a retired teacher, another a former police officer, and the third a nurse. All had been part of the same close-knit community. All had been involved in local charity events and the same block party. But there was something more, something darker that I couldn't piece together. I needed to go back to the file and keep looking. That night I stayed late at the office, poring over the case details with the growing sense of dread. I printed out copies of the photos and witness statements and started pinning them up on the wall like a mad detective in a crime drama. I noticed a detail I had missed earlier. Each victim had an odd, almost identical mark on their right hand, a strange symbol that resembled a crescent moon. I pulled up their personal records, trying to figure out if they had anything in common, and found something unexpected. Each victim had received a strange letter shortly before their deaths, a letter that contained only the words, "Your turn is coming." My heart started to race. It was as though the killer had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But as I stared at the letters, my mind drifted back to the block party. I tried to remember faces, names, anything that could link me to these victims. I couldn't place anyone specifically, but then a chilling thought crossed my mind. What if I was next? The idea seemed absurd at first. I had no real connection to the victims beyond the shared party. But the more I thought about it, the more I began to question my own memories of that night. It hit me late that evening, in the quiet of my office. I had never thought to check my own name. In a last-ditch effort to make sense of it all, I pulled up the records of every attendee at the block party. My eyes skimmed the list, stopping abruptly when I saw my own name near the bottom. I had attended the party, yes, but I hadn't seen the connection until now. The list of names wasn't just a list, it was a list of victims. Some of the names matched exactly with those of the deceased. I had been unknowingly standing next to a murderer at the party, or maybe even someone who had been plotting all along. I suddenly felt cold. There was something about the thought of being on that list, of being connected to these unsolved murders, that made me feel as though I was being watched. I tried to call my best friend, Alex, to talk through my thoughts, but the phone line went dead after one ring. I texted him and received no reply. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had become part of the case, that the killer had been watching me just as closely as they had watched the others. What if the mark on my right hand was coming next? What if it was my turn? By the time I decided to leave the office, it was almost midnight. The streets were empty, and the night seemed unnaturally quiet. As I reached the door, I glanced back at the case file on my desk. It was just sitting there, waiting for me to solve it, waiting for me to discover that the killer was closer than I had ever imagined. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to leave, and that's when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. I wasn't alone anymore. I tried to run, but I knew that the killer had already found me. Story 17. The excitement of moving into my new home had quickly faded into exhaustion. The unpacking process felt endless, and the thought of organizing everything was overwhelming. It was an old house, built in the 1920s, with creaky floorboards and dusty corners, but it had character something modern homes lacked. I had always dreamed of owning a place like this, and despite its imperfections, I felt a strange sense of belonging. As I dusted off an old armoire in the living room, I noticed something unusual, a small, almost hidden trapdoor beneath the floorboards. At first, I thought it was just part of the house's quirk, perhaps a remnant of the building's past. Curiosity got the better of me. I knelt down and pried open the trapdoor, surprised at how easily it gave way. Beneath it was a steep, narrow staircase leading into darkness. The air that wafted up from below was musty, like it hadn't been disturbed in decades. I had never seen this in the house's blueprints or heard anything about a hidden basement. My heart raced with a mixture of excitement and caution. I wasn't sure whether I was about to uncover something historic or make a huge mistake. Against my better judgment, I grabbed a flashlight and made my way down the stairs. The steps creaked under my weight, but they held steady. As I descended, the temperature dropped, and I could feel the oppressive silence of the space around me. The basement was large, much bigger than I had anticipated. The walls were lined with old, rotting wood, and the floor was uneven, covered in a thick layer of dust. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if time had stood still down here. I took a slow step forward, my flashlight beam cutting through the shadows. The further I explored, the stranger it became. There was no sign of any utilities, no pipes, no wires, nothing that would indicate the basement was ever meant to be used. But that wasn't what unsettled me the most. In one corner of the basement, I noticed a large wooden chest, its edges covered in dust. But the wood still looked oddly new. There was something about it that drew me in, a magnetic pull that I couldn't explain. I approached it cautiously, and as I knelt beside it, I noticed something carved into the side, a symbol I didn't recognize. It looked ancient, like something out of a forgotten cult or secret society. I felt a strange compulsion to open the chest, as if some unseen force was urging me forward. My hands shook as I lifted the lid, and when it creaked open, I was met with an odd sight. The chest wasn't filled with antiques or valuables as I had imagined, but rather with a collection of old photographs, some in black and white, others in sepia tones. The people in the photos were all strangers to me, though they had a familiar air about them. Their eyes seemed to follow me as I flipped through the pictures. Each one showed the same basement, but the people in them were posed differently, sometimes standing, other times kneeling or sitting, as if they were part of some ritual. One photo in particular stood out. It was of a man who looked eerily similar to me, though the picture was decades old. He stood in the exact spot where I had just been, his face frozen in a somber expression, his eyes staring directly into the camera. There was something unsettling about his gaze, as if he knew something I didn't. As I studied the photo, my pulse quickened and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I felt like I had seen him before, like I had somehow known him my entire life. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away, but the feeling lingered. A sudden creak from the far corner of the basement snapped me back to reality. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wasn't alone. I couldn't explain why, but the air felt heavier, the shadows seemed deeper. I shone my flashlight toward the sound, but all I saw was a large, old chair facing the wall. There was nothing else in the corner, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that something had moved. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the unease in my gut told me otherwise. I stood up quickly, my flashlight trembling in my hand, and began to move toward the stairs. Just as I turned to leave, my foot hit something hard, and I stumbled. I looked down and saw that I had stepped on a thick, worn rug that I hadn't noticed before. The rug was partly rolled up, and as I pulled it back, my breath caught in my throat. Beneath it was another trapdoor, much larger than the one in the living room. It was old and rusted, with a heavy metal handle. My hand hovered over it for a moment, uncertainty and fear warring inside me. I knew I should leave this place and never come back, but a strange urge to open it gripped me. Something told me that whatever lay beneath would explain the mystery of this hidden basement. I turned the handle, my heart pounding as the door creaked open. Beneath it was a narrow, stone staircase that descended even further into the earth. The air down there was colder, almost freezing, and it smelled of decay. As I stood at the top of the stairs, I heard faint whispers, distant voices, too soft to make out, but unmistakably there. My mind raced, and for a moment I considered turning back. But curiosity pushed me forward. With each step, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as though they were beckoning me to come closer. I reached the bottom of the stairs and found myself in a small, damp chamber. The walls were covered in strange markings, similar to the symbol I had seen on the chest. But what caught my eye was what lay in the center of the room. It was a large stone pedestal, and on top of it was an open book. The pages were yellowed with age, and the writing was in a language I didn't recognize. I moved closer, unable to resist the pull, and as I leaned over the pedestal to read, the air seemed to hum with energy. I couldn't understand the words, but somehow I knew that they were meant for me. A sudden cold wind rushed through the chamber, and I heard a voice behind me, a voice I knew all too well. "You shouldn't have come here," it said softly, but with a sense of finality. I spun around, my heart stopping in my chest. There, standing in the doorway, was my grandfather. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, everything changed. Story 18. It was well past midnight when I received a text that jolted me awake. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, and I groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. The message was from an unknown number, the sender's name showing up as just a string of random digits. Normally, I'd ignore a late-night message from an unfamiliar number, but something about this one felt different. The text didn't say anything at first, there was just a photo attached. I clicked on the image without thinking, expecting something trivial, maybe a meme or a wrong number apology. But when the photo loaded, my heart dropped into my stomach. It was a picture of me, asleep in my bed. The angle was strange, as if the person had been standing outside my bedroom window when the photo was taken. The blinds were pulled slightly, but the person had somehow captured a clear shot of me, lying under the covers. I stared at it for a few seconds, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. My pulse quickened as I scanned the image again, looking for any clue that might explain it. The window wasn't visible in the photo, but I knew the angle well. It was taken from the street outside my house. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a prank, a random message sent by mistake. But something in my gut told me this wasn't just an accident. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My phone buzzed again, breaking my train of thought. Another message from the same number appeared. "Sleep tight," it said, with no further explanation. I froze, my fingers still gripping the phone. Sleep tight. It felt like a sick joke, but I knew deep down it wasn't. The photo, The message, it was all too specific, too personal. I looked around my dark bedroom, half expecting to see someone standing in the corner, watching me. But there was nothing, only the silence of the night. I stared at the screen, my mind racing. What should I do? The logical part of me told me to call the police, but I couldn't shake the feeling that doing so would just make me sound paranoid. Who could have taken the picture? Who was this person, and how had they gotten so close? I glanced over at the window, my heart pounding. The blinds were still slightly open, just as they had been in the photo. I hadn't remembered leaving them like that, but the possibility of someone standing outside, watching me while I slept, filled me with an intense dread. I quickly got out of bed and moved to the window. My hands trembled as I pulled the blinds open fully, peering outside into the dark yard. Nothing. No sign of anyone or anything unusual. The street was quiet, and the houses across the road stood motionless in the dark. I exhaled shakily, telling myself I was overreacting. But then I realized something. If someone had been out there, they could have been hiding in the shadows, just outside of view. It was unsettling, to say the least. I shut the blinds tightly, trying to steady my breath. My phone buzzed again. This time it was another photo. My hand shook as I clicked on the message. The new photo was different. It was a picture of the street outside my house, taken from across the road. There was a shadowy figure in the background, but it wasn't clear enough to make out any features. My heart stopped as I tried to make sense of it. The figure was positioned in such a way that it almost looked like they were waiting for something, maybe even watching me. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Whoever was sending these messages had been outside my house for longer than I had thought. They had been watching me, waiting. My throat tightened as I realized that I was no longer just dealing with a prank. This was something much darker. My mind flashed to the image of the figure in the second photo. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, maybe even still watching. I sat down on the edge of my bed, trying to think clearly. Should I call the police now? I didn't even know what to say. I had no proof that anyone had been outside, other than these photos. And what if the police thought I was just overreacting? My mind raced through the possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. What did this person want from me? And why was I being targeted? I glanced at the screen again, and just as I was about to delete the photos, another message popped up. "You should close the blinds next time," it read. The text sent a surge of panic through me. The message was not only an invasion of my privacy, but it also implied that this person had been watching me for some time, had been waiting for me to leave the blinds open. My pulse quickened as the room suddenly felt too small. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the quietness of the night felt suffocating. I stood up, my legs unsteady, and moved to the door. I needed to check every corner of the house, make sure everything was locked, make sure I wasn't imagining things. But as I opened the door to leave my room, my phone buzzed one last time. The screen lit up, and the message sent a wave of icy dread over me. It was a simple sentence, but it felt like the final nail in the coffin. "Look behind you." I turned quickly, my breath caught in my throat, but the room was empty. No one was there. Still, the words echoed in my mind, each one seeping into my skin like poison. I felt as if I were being suffocated, as though someone, somewhere was right behind me, watching my every move. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. The silence felt suffocating, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I slowly backed away from the door, never once taking my eyes off the dark corners of the room. I had no idea who was watching me, or why, but I knew one thing for certain: I was no longer alone. Story 19. I had been in the hospital for a few days after a minor surgery. The recovery was slow, but nothing out of the ordinary. The ward was quiet, and the other patients mostly kept to themselves. But from the first night, something felt off. It wasn't the discomfort of the sterile hospital environment or the beeping of machines. It was a feeling, a nagging sense that something wasn't right. At night, When the lights were dimmed and the nurses made their rounds, I started hearing strange noises in the hallway. The first night, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I woke up in the middle of the night to the faint sound of footsteps echoing down the corridor outside my room. It was a slow, deliberate pace, heavy boots or shoes, dragging just slightly. I strained my ears, waiting for the sound to come closer, but when I peeked out through the small crack in my door, no one was there. The hallway was empty. It was as if the footsteps had been nothing but a figment of my imagination. I tried to dismiss it, but the noise continued the next night, and the next. Each time I'd hear those same heavy footsteps, followed by the creaking of a door, as if someone was entering or leaving a room. I mentioned it to a nurse the next day, but she just gave me a sympathetic smile and brushed it off. Hospitals can play tricks on your mind, especially when you're not feeling well, she said, her tone dismissive, as though she thought I was just imagining things. But I wasn't so sure. The noises seemed too real, and they happened at the same time every night. I started setting my watch to see if the footsteps followed a pattern, but when I checked the time, it was always around 3 a.m., the same time every night. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was walking the halls while everyone else was asleep. One night, when the footsteps came again, I couldn't resist. I quietly swung my legs over the side of the bed, carefully trying not to make a sound. I grabbed my IV pole for support and moved toward the door. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. The sound of creaking doors echoed in the hallway, just as it had every night. I crept out into the dimly lit corridor, half expecting to see nothing, but the air felt thick, heavier than it should have. I walked a few steps, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet, and reached the nurse's station. The lights were low, and the desk was empty, but I could see the shadows of figures moving further down the hall. I froze. I could hear a door creak open, followed by a soft conversation in hushed tones, but I couldn't make out the words. I took a cautious step forward, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was there. As I rounded the corner, I saw her, Nurse Thompson. She was standing by the door to room 304, talking to someone I couldn't see, but something was wrong. Nurse Thompson had died months ago, or so I had been told. I remembered reading her obituary after the accident, a car crash, they said. But here she was, standing there, looking perfectly fine, as if nothing had ever happened. I blinked, trying to clear the haze from my mind. Maybe I was still half dreaming, or maybe I had just misremembered the details. But the sight of Nurse Thompson standing there, her uniform pristine and her face calm, was impossible to ignore. I called out to her softly, not wanting to startle her. "Nurse Thompson." She turned, her face breaking into a small, tight-lipped smile. "You're awake, dear," she said, her voice calm and soothing, just like it always was. "You should be resting." I took a step back, my breath catching in my throat. "But you're supposed to be dead." The words tumbled out before I could stop them. Her smile faltered for just a moment. "Everyone has their time, don't they?" she replied cryptically. "You should return to your room. It's not safe out here." Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. I wanted to follow her, but something told me it was better not to. My mind was racing. Had I imagined the whole thing? Maybe I had heard the wrong things, seen the wrong person. But the feeling in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. The next day, I asked the nurses about Nurse Thompson, and they all looked at me like I was crazy. No one had seen her, and no one seemed to know what I was talking about. When I asked about the accident, they just gave me blank stares. "There is no Nurse Thompson on this floor," one of the nurses said. "Are you sure you're feeling okay?" She seemed to brush off my concerns just like the others. But I knew what I had seen, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right in this hospital. That night, I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The footsteps continued just like before, and this time I could hear faint whispers like a conversation in the distance. It sounded like it was coming from the same direction as the nurse's station. I waited for hours, my mind racing, before finally deciding to get up and investigate again. I stepped out into the hallway, this time more determined to get answers. As I walked quietly toward the source of the noises, I noticed the hallway was darker than it had been before. The light seemed dimmer, flickering in an almost unnatural way. As I reached the end of the hall, I saw a figure standing by the door to room 304. It was Nurse Thompson again. But this time she wasn't alone. Standing beside her was the shadowy figure of a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the darkness. The air around them felt thick, charged with something I couldn't name. The whispers grew louder, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. "Nurse Thompson," I whispered, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the door, as if she was waiting for something or someone. I was about to turn and run when the door to room 304 creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the room had been consumed by it. A cold wind rushed out from within, and I felt my chest tighten. Suddenly the door slammed shut, and the footsteps began again, this time echoing in the opposite direction, growing fainter as they moved down the hallway. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. Nurse Thompson, standing at the end of the hallway, staring directly at me. Her smile was gone. There was only a hollow emptiness in her eyes. "You should have stayed in your room," she said, her voice a whisper that echoed through the empty hall. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, but as I did, I felt the coldness closing in, the whispers following me, and I knew one thing for certain: something was waiting for me in the dark. Story 20. The warning had always been there, quietly lingering in the back of my mind. My landlord, an old man named Mr. Graves, had always been polite but oddly insistent when it came to the attic. "Best leave that space alone," he'd said on the day I moved in. "It's for storage, not something you'd want to mess with. Just leave it be." At the time, I had brushed off his words as harmless eccentricity. After all, he had a reputation for being a bit of a recluse. But as the weeks passed, my curiosity grew, gnawing at me each time I climbed the stairs past the door to the attic. The house was old, well over a century, and had a certain charm to it that drew me in. The creaky floors, the tall windows, the faint smell of wood and age, it all felt comforting, like stepping back in time. Yet, that attic remained locked, its darkened presence looming above. There was something about the way Mr. Graves had said it, something in his tone that hinted at more than just a simple storage area. I had always been one to respect boundaries, but the thought of what might lie behind that locked door slowly started to consume me. One night, after months of wondering, I found myself alone in the house with an unusually quiet evening stretching before me. The house felt colder than usual, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Maybe it was the rain tapping gently against the windows, or perhaps it was the silence that seemed to hum in the air. I was sitting in the living room, staring absently at the flickering light from the fireplace, when my gaze fell on the attic door. The key to the attic was in the drawer beside me, where Mr. Graves had left it when I first moved in. Without thinking, I reached for it. I don't know what compelled me to finally do it. Maybe it was the quiet persistence of my curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper, something I couldn't fully explain. But as my fingers wrapped around the key, I felt an odd sense of inevitability. I stood, walked up the stairs, and inserted the key into the old lock. The door creaked open, and the stale air of the attic rushed out, carrying the smell of dust and forgotten years. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and was immediately hit with the weight of the spacer room that hadn't seen daylight in who knows how long. The attic was dim, only a faint shaft of light from the small window illuminating the corners of the room. Dust hung in the air like a heavy fog, and the wooden beams above were covered in thick layers of cobwebs. Old boxes and crates were scattered around the floor, some stacked on top of one another, others tipped over, their contents spilling out. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the space was holding its breath, waiting for someone to disturb its long-held secrets. I glanced around, half expecting to see something move in the shadows, but the room was empty save for the dust, the forgotten things, and the haunting silence. I walked toward the far corner, where a set of old, dusty suitcases sat stacked. Their leather surfaces were cracked, worn with age, and the brass clasps had tarnished to a dull green. They looked ancient, likely forgotten relics of previous tenants, shoved into the attic and left to gather dust. I reached for the top one, my hands shaking slightly as I unlatched it. Inside was a collection of old clothes, yellowed with time. But beneath them, buried at the bottom of the suitcase, was something far more unsettling, a stack of photographs, each one slightly curled at the edges. The first photograph I pulled out was a family portrait of my family. I could barely breathe as I looked at the smiling faces. There was my father, younger than I had ever known him, standing proudly beside my mother. But it wasn't just them. In the picture, there were faces I didn't recognize, strangers whose sentence sent an icy chill down my spine. I flipped through the stack quickly, each photograph more disturbing than the last. There were pictures of me of my childhood, but I was so much younger than I remembered. Some of the photos were taken in places I had never been, with people I didn't know, their faces staring at the camera with an odd familiarity. One photograph, in particular, caught my eye. It was a picture of me as a toddler, sitting on the lap of a woman I didn't recognize. She was smiling at the camera, her arms around me protectively. But there was something off about the way she looked. Her eyes were too intense, too knowing. And behind her, the background seemed to warp, as if the picture itself was somehow wrong. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach as I stared at the image. There was no way this photo could have been taken. I had no memory of it, and yet there I was, sitting on her lap, smiling innocently. My hands trembled as I shuffled through the rest of the photos. There were more of my family, my parents, my siblings, but none of them looked like they belonged in my memories. They seemed out of place, as if someone had taken moments from my life and twisted them into something I couldn't quite recognize. I felt my breath quicken, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It was as if I was staring into an alternate version of my life, one that I had never lived, one that didn't belong to me. I dropped the photographs back into the suitcase, my heart racing. I couldn't stop looking at the woman in the photo. Her presence felt so wrong, like she had been inserted into my life, but I couldn't figure out why. My head was spinning, and the weight of the attic seemed to press down on me with each passing second. The images in those photos were impossible, yet they were right there in front of me. I didn't understand how they could exist, how they could be in my family's past when I had no memory of them. Suddenly, a voice echoed through my mind, "What did you find?" I froze, my blood running cold. I had been so absorbed in the photographs that I hadn't noticed the soft creak of the attic door behind me. Slowly, I turned around, my body stiff with fear. The door was open just slightly, and the dim light from the hallway made the room feel even more suffocating. I hadn't heard anyone come up the stairs, but there, in the doorway, stood Mr. Graves. His face was pale, his eyes wide with something I couldn't quite read. "You shouldn't have opened that suitcase," he said, his voice trembling. Some things are better left forgotten." My blood ran cold as his words sank in. There was more to this house, more to my family than I could ever have imagined. And now I had uncovered something that shouldn't have been found. Story 21. It was a rainy afternoon when I first spotted the abandoned car. I was walking home from work, the streets quiet and slick under the steady downpour, when I noticed the vehicle parked on the side of the road. It was an old, beaten-up sedan with cracked windows and a dented door. No one was around, and the car looked like it had been there for days, maybe even longer. Curiosity tugged at me, and as I walked closer, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat, a phone lying on the passenger seat, partially visible through the cracked window. I couldn't help myself. I approached the car, glancing around nervously to make sure no one was watching, and tried the door handle. It creaked open without resistance, as if it had been left ajar for anyone to find. The phone on the seat was older, cracked at the edges but still functional.